Today I'll be talking about some of our work on modeling, like the neural theory of learning, which I thought would be a good fit for this session. But before that, I wanted to just give you an overview about how we think about this problem that we're interested in the lab, which is understanding the neural basis for motor control and learning. So essentially what we're interested in doing is mapping the computations that underpin behavior that I'm representing on the left into the implementation by the nervous system. And the conceptual framework that we are adopting for that we outlined in this opinion paper last year with Josh is basically embracing and trying to put together a few recent findings that kind of challenge the status quo. For example, evidence even in simple behaviors like forward movement in mice and monkeys suggests that these computations don't match one-on-one onto brain regions, but rather they are like redundantly implemented in the brain. This is related to what Christine mentioned about degeneracy in the nervous system. And also, increasing evidence suggests that if you look at two different actions and the brain structures involved in controlling them, this may be completely different. And to make things even more complicated, the way that these structures acquire the skill also changes over time and changes when animals are adapting the skill to a new context, as I'll be talking about today. And of course, this is also completely different during development. So what we are trying to understand, we think, is like basically this hierarchical system in which the relative contribution of the different component parts changes both across tasks and over time. And the work we are doing in the lab, like James Candy said, is like looking at principles of neural dynamics across the brain. We're also now looking very heavily into spinal motor neuron control, because these are the cells that integrate all the input from the nervous system to make muscles contract and control movement. And finally, we are trying to bridge across these different levels of description and timescales and tasks by using computational models, which is what I'm talking about today, because it felt fitting for a neural theory session. And the kind of learning that I'm going to be talking about is something that starts with this very simple picture. That is what happens when you drop something in a pond and you are trying to retrieve it. So essentially what you do, and we know this, is that if you want to reach some object that is at the bottom of a pond, you are going to aim to the wrong direction. And this is because of the way that the light, you get like this sort of visual feedback because of how the light is reflected throughout water, right? But we also know that if you try a few times, your brain will be able to understand this distorted feedback and anticipate their effects and aim in the right direction. And I guess you can run an experiment on the swimming pool later if you're interested. But also John Krakauer pioneered this experiment 25 years ago in a paper where he basically asked humans to learn to compensate for distorted feedback. And my friend Matt Perrick, now an assistant professor in Montreal, did these experiments in monkeys while we were together in Northwestern. So basically, Matt trained monkeys to do this central reaching task using a robotic manipulandum. And monkeys, become amazingly good at this, much better than either of us were. And here you can see the trajectories of the hand as monkeys were reaching at different targets in normal conditions, right? Now the trick is that we are basically what Matt did was rotate the visual feedback around the center of the workstage. So now what the monkeys are seeing is the cursor. If the monkeys move up, the cursor would move like 30 degrees to the left, a bit like this. And when you do that, like monkeys start aiming in the wrong direction, and then they have to compensate for this rotation, right? And this is the same that humans do. But the interesting thing is that after a few tens of trials, monkeys learn to predict this rotation and basically aim again in a straight line toward the target. Okay, this is the same as humans again. And when you remove this rotation, the interesting thing is that monkeys have to forget about the perturbation. So they're making errors in the opposite direction for a few trials because their brain is compensating for a perturbation that is no longer there. And this is the usual way to plot it. You have zero error, then you have like a big error similar to the perturbation. You learn to almost cancel it out completely, and then you remove the rotation, and you have to wash out your adaptation. Okay. So in terms of the neural computations that underpin this, the traditional view, if you grab any textbook, is that this is mediated by updating internal models, right? So basically this picture from a classic paper shows that we have forward models that predict the sensory consequences of actions, and when you are exposed to these perturbations, you are basically adapting this forward model, and then the associated inverse model, that is the one that specifies the motor commands, gets updated at the same time. And this process is what mediates learning, okay? So based on this study and many influential studies, the field adapted this vision in which basically motor adaptation is based on updating this forward model that predicts the consequences of actions, and then the brain inverts the model to issue updated motor commands, okay? So the question is, how does the brain do all this stuff, right? This is what it became in the field, but in the meantime, like a recent paper from Adrian Heath and John Krakauer's lab suggested that maybe there's another way to think about this. And it's a bit more straightforward if you want. The idea is like the proposal is that the brain may actually be learning by directly updating their policy, their control policy. So in other words, what the brain may be doing is that you receive an error in the sensory domain and you map it into an error through some function in the control domain. So essentially you are, this doesn't mean that you don't have a forward model that gets adapted. What this means is that you are basically adapting this control policy. And in this paper that, if you are curious, I think you should all read, the view is, they show this using two behavioral tasks that lead to distinguishing predictions about adaptation. It's most consistent to the control policy update. Okay? Oh, it's clear so far. So these observations and a few other studies inspired Barbara Foyner, a wonderful PhD student that Claudia Klopath and I co-supervised, to try to basically build a model and see if it could learn this way, in a bit of a Richard Feynman view of trying to build something to understand it. So Barbara started from the idea that the computations of substrate for motor control and learning may be intimately related, meaning that the same control policy that mediates control may be adapted to achieve adaptation, as Alki suggested in 2021. And the way we wanted to build this model was making the minimum set of assumptions possible. So we basically had a single modular recurrent neural network and optimized it and wanted to understand which computations emerged in order for this form of learning to happen, okay? And as I said, that this is published, so you can check out the paper later if you're interested. So basically, this is the model that we built. So we had a recurrent neural network, like the very vanilla architecture. But instead of having the network just output patterns based on inputs, what we wanted the network was to basically control its output. So the network was controlling the position of an effector that was like the monkey hand based on sensory error that we simply define as the deviation from an optimal trajectory. But also, like in the paper, we saw that using different error functions leads to the same qualitative results. And then this error was delayed by 120 milliseconds like it is in our bodies because we don't get instantaneous sensory feedback, okay? So using this very simple architecture, like Barbara could train it to do control. So basically what we did was first train the network to reach to different endpoints with different directions and different extents, as you see on the left, using vanilla gradient descent. And then we trained these feedback corrections that did the online control by adding like basically random perturbations that the network had to compensate for. So all very simple. But the nice thing is that once we had this network, we could ask it, for example, to perform the center out task that we had studied in monkeys, and the network would do it, obviously, okay? So these are the movements that it outputted. And then we could add this visomotor rotation, and the network would be able to compensate for the rotation. So here you can see that after enough time has elapsed in order for feedback to arrive back, the network is able to correct the movements and reach the target, okay? And this is obviously contingent on the feedback connections. If we basically cut them, the networks cannot do the task, okay? So we have the first piece of the puzzle. We have a network that can control its output based on incoming feedback. Another question is, can the network learn like the monkeys did? And this is just the same plots as before, but with colors. So what Barbara did was devise a very simple biologically plausible plasticity rule that is local and basically just updates the weight onto a postsynaptic neuron based on the incoming feedback and the history of the recent activity. And we have a neuroscience paper on that by Clara Caleb. So you can see here that already during the first few trials, these trajectories are not all identical, right? You can see that the network is little by little seems to be re-aiming. And this is more clear after, if you plot a few tens of trials later. Like the network has learned to re-aim the reaches, just again using this incoming error feedback and recent activity, okay? And this is learned trial by trial, as you can see here. And you also have like this nice exponential decay and error, like in monkeys. If you compare like the two sets of red traces, and we also have a nice washout period. So the network has also to forget the perturbation, okay? So this very simple network that just minimizes the online error is able to learn in a way that behaviorally replicates that of monkeys and humans. But now the question is, does the underpinning activity look like a brain at all? Okay. So what we did was look at neural activity across different epochs of the task in order to compare it to recordings from primary motor cortex that we had made in monkeys doing this task. And we are focusing on primary motor cortex because this is a part of the brain that is primarily involved in both online control of movement and motor learning, okay? So this is like the brain area that we think is most similar to our model, even though we don't think our model is just a particular brain region. It's just like a neural circuit. So if we look at the overall activity changes in the network from end of adaptation to early adaptation, we see that there's basically 2 bumps, okay, during a trial. This is average across all neurons, and we could do other analysis to show that the second bump is related to feedback corrections, and the first one is related to basically this feed-forward re-aiming. And I will show you a bit more about this in a few slides. But the interesting thing is that then we could do the same exact analysis in monkey M1, and we saw the same 2 bump activity changes with 2 peaks. And these 2 peaks actually had also similar height, like in the networks. Okay? So we could look at this. These are example sessions, but we could look at this across many networks and 2 monkeys and many sessions. And we saw that the activity changes qualitatively match those we observed in monkeys. And as I said, that this is only true if the amount of neurons receiving feedback is biologically sensible. Okay, this is shown in the supplement of the paper. So when network learns in a way that resembles that of monkeys and looks like monkey motor cortex. And actually, we think this is interesting because we had simultaneous recordings from premotor cortex. And premotor cortex is involved in motor control, but not as much in these closed-loop feedback corrections. Okay, so we expected it to look less similar than the model to the model than M1 did. And just as a reminder, this is the M1 activity changes in pink. And if I show you the PMD activity changes, they are quite different. And this is just one synapse upstream. So like Christine said, the brain is not the same everywhere. And, again, across all recordings, we see consistently that only monkey M1 looks like our model. Okay. So, but, the beauty, as I said, of having an RNN is that we can really dissect what is going on in the network. So what we did was look at the learning process and the underlying computations, basically. So what I'm going to show you here is the overall activity changes in the network as adaptation progresses. So this is going down. And you see that most of the activity, there's basically 2 bumps that change as the network adapts. You have early on, you have these feedback-driven corrections that happen late during the trial. And then the network enters a mode in which is basically issuing other motor commands. So this is like the re-aiming. Okay, so the peak goes from these late-stage corrections to early-stage re-aiming. And this was consistent across all networks. As you can see here, I'm just integrating in this window. So early on is very feedback-driven. Later on is related to learning. Okay, so there's these 2 different processes going on in the network that mediate adaptation. But we are interested in whether, because, again, we only ask networks to do this, so learn how to reach, and then learn how to counteract the perturbation trial by trial, right? So what we ask is, did the networks acquire 2 modules, then one that does learning and feed-forward aiming, and another that does feedback control? Or are they like a single module and everything is distributed? So first we looked at, we randomly plotted units, and this is a bit like doing single neuron recordings in an animal. And you can see in brains, units are a bit similar but a bit different. But again, we could look at all the units in the network and basically ask whether there were 2 subpopulations in a very rigorous way. So if there were neurons that only do learning of re-aiming, we should have units that have very little activity during the feedback epoch and have a lot of activity during learning. And this would be this blue blob, okay? And if we have feedback neurons, then we would have this green blob, basically, okay? And if I show you all units from a network as independent points, what you see is that most of them are both, okay? So both neurons in the network are contributing to these 2 computations. So the implementation is intermixed. But now the last thing that we wanted to know, that is what inspired this core work, is whether the networks were effectively learning by updating their policy, which we expected, right, based on the way we had designed them. So I'm going to show you two analyses that indicate that this is the case. The first one is more a correlative analysis. So what we did is basically look at the adaptation epoch, which I'm showing here in red. And our idea is that if the network is updating its control policy, the relationship between ongoing neural activity and the movement that is going to happen in the near future should change during learning, right? Because this is what a control policy is. So what we did was train a decoder that predicted future movement from ongoing activity when the network had learned to counteract the perturbation. And then we ran it backwards in time with the prediction that the model should get worse and worse and worse early on during learning, because this is when the network still doesn't know how to do the task. And this is exactly what we found. And by the way, we have the same result in our paper on monkey electrophysiology that I cited earlier. But this is only correlative, so can we show causal evidence? And this is the beauty of RNNs, that you can actually do that. So this is, again, what is going on when we do like the baseline trials. So for example, here, if you want this green input, leads you to reach up, right, to the 12 o'clock direction. And then we train the network to basically do a 45-degree rotation. And what you see here now is that this green input makes you reach toward 2 p.m. Okay? So this shows that at the end of learning, the same input is producing a different output, meaning that the control policy has changed during learning. Okay. So far I've only shown you that this very simple model recapitulates behavior in this task, and it does it through processes that are implemented at the neural level and that underpin like the policy update. But the nice thing about studying this task is actually there's tons of papers on little effects in human behavior of manipulating this perturbation. So we're going to show you, to finish, like a few examples of other studies that we could readily reproduce with our model. First, there's evidence that the amount of learning in one trial is correlated to the error in the previous trial. So the bigger your error in trial 1, the largest your correction or your learning in trial 2. So we did that analysis in our network, and we found a positive correlation, which magnitude was similar to that of monkeys. So the network captures that. It also captures the effect that if you add noise to the rotation, so you make it a bit variable across trials, people seem to learn worse. And we also, the last effect that I want to show you is this intuitive effect that if you learn something, it will generalize to similar actions, but not different actions. Okay? So this is from the original Krakauer paper, where he asked people to basically adapt rotations to a single target, and he showed that if then you expose them to similar movements, they will generalize the adaptation, but not if the movements are different. And this is exactly what we found. If you test on the next targets, the adaptation generalizes, but not to the close ones. Okay? And this is just the way we quantified it in the paper, just because within the Krakauer paper, if you look at the adaptation flip upside down, so the error, the two look the same. Okay? So this is one more thing that our model recapitulated. And the last thing is this effect of causal manipulations in monkey motor cortex. So Sarah Vias did this study in monkeys in Krishna Shenoy's lab. And what he did was stimulate below threshold when monkeys were about to move during this task to basically impede learning. So what he showed is that when you do this, monkeys take a bit longer to respond, to initiate movement, and that the error in this trial doesn't change. So they're as good as generating the movement, but the amount of learning decreases. So the error in the next trial is smaller, basically because you cannot use the previous action to update your control policy. And this is what happened in our network. Reaction time increased, error in current trial didn't increase, but there was a deficit in learning. Okay. So just to wrap up, I've told you very quickly about our philosophical approach to understanding neural basis of motor control by looking across behaviors and timescales. I focus on adaptation and show you our model of direct policy updates in RNNs and how it recapitulates human and monkey behavior. Looks like monkey M1, the structure we thought it would look like, and also like it recapitulates many other behavioral studies. And I wanted to flag in very quickly a few other studies. I won't have time, but I'm around if you want to discuss about other work on integrating across axons and timescales. This is by Joanna Chang, a wonderful student with Claudia, who also looked at how the way you initially acquire a skill impacts future learning. She's also published a preprint on continual learning, and we also have some work on acquiring large action spaces by a great postdoc, Francesca Greenstein. So with this, thank you again for having me, and thank you everyone for your attention.